For years, the world was told one story about Burkina Faso. They said the country was isolated. They said it was too dangerous to approach. They said Ouagadougou had become a place where serious diplomacy could no longer stand. But then, in one single morning, the cameras opened, the red carpet was laid out, and 8 nations walked through the front door. Not one country, not 2, 8. Their ambassadors came to present their letters of credence before Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader so many Western voices have tried to describe as cut off from the world. And that one ceremony did something no press conference could have done. It placed a living picture in front of the planet and asked a simple question. If Burkina Faso is so isolated, why are nations from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia still sending ambassadors to Ouagadougou? And while this was happening in public, another story was unfolding in the background. France, after losing much of its old influence in the Sahel, is now accused of searching for new ways to remain close to the region through private companies, training programs, humanitarian networks, and softer tools of influence. So today, we are not just talking about one diplomatic ceremony. We are talking about a new chapter in Africa's struggle to define itself. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why this morning in Ouagadougou may have shaken more than one capital in Europe. And if you value this kind of honest African perspective, make sure you follow this channel and keep this conversation alive. Now let us look closely at what happened inside the diplomatic ceremony itself, because the details matters. At the Koulouba Palace in Ouagadougou, 8 ambassadors came forward to present their letters of credence to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. In diplomatic language, this is not a casual visit. A letter of credence is the formal document that allows an ambassador to represent one's nation before the leader of another nation. That means these countries were not just sending greetings. They were opening or renewing official lines of communication with Burkina Faso at the highest diplomatic level. Among the countries involved were nations connected to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This matters because it shows that Burkina Faso is not speaking to only one political camp. It is reaching across regions, across cultures, and across old alliances. And this is where the Western narrative begins to crack. For years, people were told that Burkina Faso was becoming untouchable, that no serious country would want to stand beside it, and that Ouagadougou was drifting into isolation. But isolation does not look like 8 ambassadors arriving in one morning. Isolation does not look like formal ceremonies, state protocol, flag, uniforms, and diplomatic recognition. Now, to be fair, this does not mean Burkina Faso has no security challenges. The country still faces real threats. The people still need peace, safety, and stability. But the ceremony proves something important. It proves that a country can face serious problems and still remain diplomatically alive. It proves that the story is more complex than the headlines suggest. And for Ibrahim Traoré, that image was powerful. Without shouting, without arguing, and without begging for approval, Burkina Faso allowed the world to see that it still has partners willing to enter through the front door. Burkina Faso's diplomatic ceremony did not happen by accident. It was part of a much broader shift that has been taking shape since Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in 2022. Rather than relying on a single international partner, his government has pursued a policy of expanding diplomatic options. Instead of looking almost exclusively toward former colonial relationships, Burkina Faso has steadily opened new channels with countries across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and other parts of the global South. This approach is based on a simple idea. A sovereign nation should have the freedom to choose its partners according to its own interests, not according to historical expectations or external pressure. That is why the presence of ambassadors from such diverse regions carries political weight. It suggests that Burkina Faso is trying to build relationships that extend beyond traditional alliances. Some of these partnerships are long established, while others are only beginning. Together, however, they reflect a foreign policy that seeks flexibility rather than dependence. This vision also fits within the broader alliance of Sahel states, formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The alliance was created to strengthen regional cooperation on security, economic development, and political coordination after relations with several Western partners deteriorated, whether one agrees with every decision made by these governments or not. The alliance represents an effort to redefine regional priorities through local leadership. For Ibrahim Traoré, diplomacy is also about changing perception. Military victories may influence events on the ground, but diplomatic recognition shapes how a nation is viewed abroad. Every ambassador received at the Koulouba Palace sent a message that Burkina Faso remains engaged with the international community. This does not erase the country's challenges, nor does it guarantee future success, but it demonstrates that many governments still see value in maintaining dialogue with Ouagadougou. In international politics, that alone is an important signal, because diplomacy is ultimately built on the willingness to keep communication alive, even during difficult times. While Burkina Faso was expanding its diplomatic outreach, another important story was unfolding beyond the cameras. France, which had once maintained a dominant military presence across much of the Sahel, was facing a very different reality. Over the past several years, French forces withdrew from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after growing political tensions and public opposition. Long-standing defense agreements were reconsidered, military bases were closed, and the regional balance that had existed for decades began to shift. Faced with these changes, many analysts argue that France has been exploring a different approach to maintaining its influence. Rather than relying primarily on visible military deployments, greater attention is now being placed on diplomatic partnerships, development assistance, security training, economic investment, cultural institutions, and cooperation with private organizations. Supporters of this strategy describe it as a more modern and cooperative model of international engagement. Critics, however, argue that these softer tools can also preserve political influence without the visibility of military bases. The debate remains active, and different observers reach different conclusions. What is clear is that influence in the 21st century is no longer measured only by the number of soldiers stationed abroad. It is increasingly measured by who trains local institutions, who finances infrastructure, who supports education, who invests in strategic industries, and who helps shape public narratives. For Burkina Faso, this changing landscape presents both opportunities and responsibilities. Expanding diplomatic choices gives the country more room to pursue its own priorities, but it also requires careful management to ensure that replacing one external dependency does not simply create another. The ceremony in Ouagadougou and the broader debate surrounding France's evolving strategy illustrate a larger transformation taking place across the Sahel. Military competition is gradually giving way to a more complex contest built around diplomacy, economics, development, and influence. In this new environment, relationships may be less visible than military bases, but they are no less important in shaping the future of the region. As this story continues, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If diplomacy is shaping the future of Africa, then who controls the story that the world hears? For decades, international narratives about the Sahel have often focused on conflict, instability, military coups, and humanitarian crises. These are real issues, and they deserve attention. However, they are not the entire picture. The ceremony in Ouagadougou offered a different image. Instead of soldiers, the cameras captured diplomats. Instead of military convoys, they showed ambassadors carrying official documents. It was a reminder that diplomacy can sometimes challenge perceptions more effectively than political speeches. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has clearly understood the importance of that symbolism, whether speaking to domestic audiences or international partners. His government has tried to present Burkina Faso as a country determined to make its own choices. For many supporters across Africa, this represents a broader message about sovereignty, dignity, and the right to pursue independent foreign policies. At the same time, it is important to recognize that critics continue to raise serious concerns about governance, democratic transition, freedom of the press, and human rights inside Burkina Faso. These concerns remain part of the international discussion and should not be ignored. The reality, therefore, is more balanced than either extreme. Burkina Faso is neither the completely isolated state described by some critics, nor a country without significant internal challenges. Both realities exist simultaneously. Perhaps that is the biggest lesson from this entire episode. Modern geopolitics is no longer fought only with weapons or military alliances. It is also fought through information, public perception, diplomatic visibility, and the ability to shape international opinion. In today's world, controlling the narrative has become almost as valuable as controlling territory. And by hosting 8 ambassadors in one carefully watched ceremony, Burkina Faso demonstrated that sometimes a single diplomatic image can reshape a conversation that has lasted for years. The events in Ouagadougou also offer valuable lessons for other African nations navigating an increasingly competitive international environment. The first lesson is that sovereignty is strongest when it is supported by diplomatic diversity. No country benefits from depending entirely on a single foreign partner. By maintaining relationships with multiple regions of the world, governments gain greater flexibility to pursue policies that reflect their own national interests. The second lesson is that natural resources alone do not create independence. Gold, uranium, strategic minerals, and agricultural wealth can strengthen a nation only if they are managed through transparent institutions, responsible leadership, and long-term planning. Without effective governance, valuable resources can easily become sources of competition rather than prosperity. A third lesson concerns strategic communication. Every nation has the right to tell its own story. If governments fail to explain their policies and achievements, others will often shape international opinion on their behalf. Public diplomacy, credible institutions, and consistent communication have become essential parts of modern statecraft. There is also an important warning. Replacing one external influence with another does not automatically create genuine independence, whether partnerships involve Western countries, emerging powers, or regional allies. Every agreement should ultimately be measured by one standard. Does it improve the lives of ordinary citizens? For Burkina Faso, the path ahead remains challenging. Security concerns, economic development, and national reconciliation will continue to test the country's leadership. Diplomatic recognition alone cannot solve these issues. Lasting success will depend on stability, accountable institutions, and opportunities for future generations. Even so, the ceremony that brought 8 ambassadors to Ouagadougou demonstrated one undeniable reality. Burkina Faso is determined to participate actively in shaping its own future. Whether the world agrees with every policy or not, the country has shown that it intends to make its choices through engagement rather than isolation, and through dialogue rather than silence. As we reach the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that the story of Burkina Faso is no longer as simple as many headlines have suggested. The ceremony at the Kuluba Palace did not erase the country's security challenges. It did not solve every political disagreement, nor did it remove the economic difficulties that many Burkinabe families continue to face. Those realities remain, and they deserve honest attention. Yet another reality also deserves recognition. When 8 ambassadors arrived to formally present their credentials before Captain Ibrahim Traoré, they send a message that extends far beyond one ceremonial event. They demonstrate that Burkina Faso continues to participate in international diplomacy, continues to build partnerships, and continues to make choices about its own future. At the same time, France and other international actors are reassessing their place in a rapidly changing Sahel. Influence today is no longer defined only by military bases or security agreements. It is increasingly shaped by diplomacy, investment, education, development, and the ability to build lasting partnerships. Ultimately, the future of Africa will not be determined solely by outside powers. It will depend on the decisions made by African leaders, African institutions, and African citizens themselves. The countries that succeed will be those that protect their sovereignty while remaining open to balanced cooperation with the wider world. So, what do you think? Did the arrival of 8 ambassadors genuinely challenge the narrative that Burkina Faso is isolated? Is Africa entering a new diplomatic era where partnerships matter more than old alliances? And how should African nations balance sovereignty with international cooperation in an increasingly competitive world? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective is an important part of this conversation. If you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe and join us for more discussions on Pan-African affairs, Burkina Faso, Africa New, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, and the future vision of Ibrahim Traoré. Until next time, thank you for watching, and take care. Have you ever seen a moment when a company that once believed a country could not function without it suddenly finds itself looking for a way back? That is exactly the question many people are asking today, as Air France seeks to restore its presence in Burkina Faso after years of absence. When the airline suspended operations, citing security concerns and regional instability, many observers predicted that Burkina Faso would become increasingly isolated from the world. Some believed international business would decline. Others warned that foreign investors would stay away. To many outside observers, the future seemed uncertain. Yet the reality unfolding in 2026 tells a very different story. Burkina Faso did not disappear from international aviation maps. Its airports did not become empty. Its connections to the world did not vanish. Instead, the country adapted. New partnerships emerged, and alternative routes continued to keep Burkina Faso connected to Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Now, the conversation has changed. Instead of asking whether Burkina Faso can survive without Air France, people are asking why Air France wants to return. The answer goes far beyond aviation. It touches on economics, sovereignty, shifting global power, and the growing confidence of African nations seeking to shape their own future. If you are interested in Africa's transformation and the forces reshaping the global balance of power, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for this fascinating discussion. When Air France suspended services to Burkina Faso, the decision was officially presented as a response to security concerns affecting the Sahel region. At the time, relations between France and several governments in the region were becoming increasingly strained. Political changes, debates about sovereignty, and growing public demands for greater independence from traditional foreign influence were dominating headlines. Many international observers interpreted the airline's departure as a sign of deeper problems ahead. Analysts warned that Burkina Faso might face economic isolation. Critics argued that reducing dependence on traditional Western partners could create long-term challenges for trade and investment. For many people, Air France represented more than an airline. It symbolized a long-standing connection between West Africa and Europe. As a result, some assumed that losing this connection would have severe consequences. What happened next, however, would challenge many of those assumptions. Burkina Faso did not become isolated. In fact, one of the most surprising developments after Air France left was how quickly other airlines continued to fill the space that many believed would remain empty. Royal Air Maroc maintained its operations and continued connecting travelers through Casablanca, one of Africa's most important aviation hubs. Ethiopian Airlines kept offering access through Addis Ababa, a city that has become a gateway linking Africa to Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Turkish Airlines continued serving the region through Istanbul, providing passengers with another major international connection point. At the regional level, ASKI Airlines, Air Côte d'Ivoire, and Air Burkina also continued playing important roles. Their presence ensured that travelers, business people, students, government officials, and families could still move across West Africa and beyond. Flights continued, trade continued, people continued to travel. This reality directly challenged the prediction that Burkina Faso would become disconnected from the rest of the world. Perhaps the most important lesson is that the global aviation landscape has changed dramatically. Decades ago, losing a major European airline could have created serious transportation difficulties for many African countries. Today, however, passengers have access to a much wider range of options. Instead of relying primarily on Paris as a gateway to the world, travelers can now connect through Casablanca, Addis Ababa, Istanbul, Lomé, Abidjan, and several other growing aviation centers. This diversification has fundamentally changed the balance of power in international air travel. For Burkina Faso, this shift proved to be extremely important. The country demonstrated that it could maintain international connectivity even when one major carrier withdrew. The presence of multiple airlines reduced dependence on a single partner and increased flexibility for travelers and businesses alike. The lesson was clear. The world of 2026 is very different from the world of 1960. Today, countries have more choices, more partners, and more opportunities to adapt when circumstances change. Burkina Faso's experience became a powerful example of that new reality. To fully understand why Air France's return has become such a symbolic topic, we must look beyond Burkina Faso itself and examine a much larger transformation taking place across Africa. For decades, European airlines dominated many of the major routes connecting Africa to the rest of the world. In large parts of West Africa, Paris served as the primary gateway for international travel. This gave certain airlines enormous influence over passenger movement, trade connections, and business travel. That reality is changing. One of the biggest drivers of this change has been the remarkable rise of Ethiopian Airlines. Over the past 2 decades, the airline has transformed itself into one of the strongest carriers in the developing world. Its network now stretches across Africa, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and North America. Addis Ababa has become one of the most important aviation hubs on the continent. At the same time, Royal Air Maroc has expanded its reach through Casablanca. The Moroccan carrier has positioned itself as a bridge connecting Africa with Europe and the Americas. For many travelers from West Africa, Casablanca now offers an alternative route that once would have required passing through Paris. Turkish Airlines has also invested heavily in Africa. By linking dozens of African cities to Istanbul, the company has created new pathways for business, tourism, and trade. Its expansion reflects a broader trend in which multiple global players are competing for access to African markets. Shahim. The result is a more diversified aviation system. No single airline controls access to entire regions the way it once might have. Countries such as Burkina Faso now operate within a far more competitive environment. This shift matters because economic influence often follows transportation networks. When travelers have more choices, governments gain more flexibility, businesses gain more options, and foreign companies must compete rather than assume loyalty. The aviation revolution taking place across Africa is not simply about airplanes. It is about changing relationships, changing markets, and changing power dynamics throughout the continent. The next question is perhaps the most interesting one of all. If Burkina Faso was supposedly becoming isolated, if the market was losing importance, and if security concerns remained a challenge, why would Air France be interested in returning? The answer begins with a simple reality that drives every major airline in the world. Airlines do not operate routes as acts of charity. They operate routes because they see demand, revenue, and long-term opportunity. Burkina Faso continues to represent an important market. Thousands of Burkinabe citizens live abroad, particularly in France and other parts of Europe. Family visits, business travel, educational exchanges, government activities, and international development projects all create a steady flow of passengers. For decades, these travel patterns helped support air connections between Burkina Faso and Europe. Those underlying needs did not disappear simply because one airline suspended operations. At the same time, competition has intensified. While Air France remained absent, other airlines strengthened their positions. Ethiopian Airlines expanded its network. Royal Air Maroc continued building Casablanca into a major gateway. Turkish Airlines reinforced its presence across Africa. Each additional passenger choosing these alternatives represented potential market share that Air France could lose permanently. From a business perspective, remaining absent for too long carries risks. Customer habits change. Travelers become familiar with new routes. Corporate clients establish new travel arrangements. Over time, winning those customers back becomes increasingly difficult. This helps explain why discussions about restoring service have continued despite political tensions and operational challenges. The significance of this situation extends beyond one company. It highlights a broader truth about modern Africa: markets with growing populations, expanding mobility, and increasing economic activity cannot easily be ignored. In that sense, the possibility of Air France returning says something important. It suggests that Burkina Faso remains relevant, connected, and economically significant enough to attract renewed attention from one of Europe's most recognized airlines. To understand why many supporters of Burkina Faso's current direction view the Air France story as significant, we must look at the leadership philosophy that has shaped much of the national conversation in recent years. At the center of that discussion stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Whether one agrees with all of his policies or not, there is little doubt that he has become one of the most influential political figures in contemporary Africa. His message has consistently focused on sovereignty, self-determination, and the belief that African nations should make decisions based on their own interests rather than external pressure. One of the themes that appears repeatedly in his speeches is the idea that partnerships should be based on mutual respect. Burkina Faso, according to this vision, should cooperate with countries and companies from around the world, but without becoming dependent on any single partner. This perspective helps explain why many of his supporters see the Air France situation differently from previous generations. In the past, the departure of a major European company might have been viewed as a national setback. Today, many people ask a different question. If one partner leaves, are there others willing to work with Burkina Faso? The answer, in this case, appears to be yes. Royal Air Maroc remained active. Ethiopian Airlines remained active. Turkish Airlines remained active. Regional carriers continued operating. The country maintained important links with international markets despite challenges. For many young Africans, this represents more than a transportation issue. It symbolizes a change in mindset. Confidence is gradually replacing dependency. Choice is replacing necessity. Of course, Burkina Faso's situation cannot be explained by leadership alone. Geography, demographics, economic demand, and broader changes in global aviation all play important roles. Yet, supporters of Ibrahim Traoré argue that his greatest contribution may not be a specific policy, but a different way of thinking. In their view, the question is no longer whether Africa can function without certain traditional partners. The question is whether Africa can negotiate with all partners from a position of greater confidence and equality. That shift in thinking may ultimately be the most important change of all. No discussion about Burkina Faso's recent trajectory would be complete without examining the criticisms that continue to come from parts of the Western political and media landscape. Some critics argue that Burkina Faso is taking unnecessary risks by distancing itself from traditional partners. They warn that changes in foreign policy could discourage investment, reduce international support, and create uncertainty for businesses considering opportunities in the country. So, others suggest that political transformations in the Sahel may lead to greater isolation from the global economy. According to this view, maintaining close relationships with long-established partners remains essential for long-term stability and development. These concerns deserve consideration. Any country undergoing significant political change faces challenges. Investors often prefer predictability. Businesses value stability. International relationships can take years to build and only months to damage. However, supporters of Burkina Faso's current direction offer a different perspective. They argue that reducing dependence on a single partner is not the same as rejecting international cooperation. In their view, the goal is diversification rather than isolation. The continued presence of airlines from Morocco, Ethiopia, Turkey, Côte d'Ivoire, and other countries is frequently cited as evidence that Burkina Faso remains connected to global networks. They also point out that markets ultimately respond to opportunity. If a country possesses economic potential, growing demand, and strategic importance, international businesses will continue to show interest regardless of political disagreements. The reality may lie somewhere between the two positions. Burkina Faso still faces genuine security and development challenges. At the same time, predictions of complete isolation have clearly not materialized. International connections remain active. Trade continues, and foreign companies continue monitoring opportunities. Perhaps the most important lesson is that modern Africa is becoming increasingly capable of engaging with multiple partners simultaneously. Rather than depending on a single center of influence, countries now have more options available to them. That changing reality is forcing governments, businesses, and international organizations alike to rethink assumptions that may have seemed unquestionable only a generation ago. The story of Air France and Burkina Faso is ultimately about far more than a single airline route. When Air France suspended service, many observers believed Burkina Faso would struggle to maintain its international connections. Some predicted isolation, others anticipated economic decline and reduced engagement with the outside world. Yet the events that followed told a different story. Other airlines continued operating, new travel patterns emerged, regional and international connections remained active. Burkina Faso demonstrated that it could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining links to the wider world. Today, the discussion surrounding Air France's potential return carries a powerful symbolic message. It suggests that the assumptions of the past may no longer apply in the same way. Countries once viewed primarily through the lens of dependency are increasingly seeking relationships built on choice, competition, and mutual benefit. Whether one fully agrees with Ibrahim Traoré's vision or not, his rise has become part of a larger conversation taking place across the continent. Questions of sovereignty, economic independence, and national confidence are being debated from the Sahel to the southern tip of Africa. For many supporters of Pan-African ideals, the Burkina Faso story represents a chapter in a broader transformation. It reflects an Africa new generation that wants more options, stronger institutions, and greater influence over its own future. The ideas of Pan-Africanism continue to inspire discussions about cooperation, self-determination, and continental development. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the government of Burkina Faso remain controversial figures in some international circles, but their impact on public debate is undeniable. Their actions have encouraged many people to reconsider long-standing assumptions about Africa's place in the global system. As the African Union and national leaders across the continent navigate an increasingly complex world, one lesson stands out. Nations that diversify partnerships and strengthen their ability to choose may find themselves in a stronger position than those that depend too heavily on any single relationship. If you believe these changes will shape the future of Africa, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more discussions on Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, and the evolving story of a changing continent. Have you noticed something unusual happening across the Sahel in recent weeks? Within a remarkably short period of time, senior officials and high-level delegations from Benin, Mauritania, and Côte d'Ivoire have all sought closer contact with the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES. For many observers, this sudden wave of diplomatic outreach has raised an important question. Why now? What makes these developments even more intriguing is that these countries were not always aligned with the political direction taken by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger during the early stages of their transitions. Yet today, messages of cooperation, dialogue, and renewed engagement seem to be coming from several directions at once. Does this signal a genuine desire for regional reconciliation, or could it represent a strategic adjustment after previous methods of pressure failed to produce the expected results? While no one can claim to know every discussion taking place behind closed doors, one thing is certain: the diplomatic landscape around AES is changing. To understand what may be happening, we first need to examine a larger reality. The AES that many critics once predicted would struggle to survive is no longer viewed in the same way. Over the past few years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have strengthened cooperation in security, political coordination, and regional planning. Instead of disappearing from the regional scene, the alliance has become one of the most closely watched developments in West Africa. And if you care about the future of the Sahel and the rise of a more self-reliant Africa, be sure to subscribe to the channel because the story we are about to explore may reveal much more than a series of diplomatic visits. The recent diplomatic activity surrounding the Alliance of Sahel States has not gone unnoticed. One event involved the new leadership of Benin seeking greater engagement with AES members. Discussions reportedly included the possibility of reopening important border connections and restoring stronger economic exchanges. Such proposals naturally attract attention because regional trade remains vital for both neighboring countries and local populations that depend on cross-border commerce. Another development came from Mauritania. Senior officials emphasized cooperation on security matters, regional stability, and coordination against common threats. Given the security challenges that continue to affect parts of the Sahel, such discussions can be viewed as practical and necessary. However, Many citizens are still asking why these initiatives appear to be arriving almost simultaneously. Then there is Côte d'Ivoire. Statements supporting closer communication and cooperation with AES have added another layer to the conversation. For many observers, the question is not whether dialogue should exist. Most people recognize that neighboring states must communicate. The real question is why several governments that once appeared distant from the political direction of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are now expressing interest in renewed engagement. Supporters of AES often point to this timing as significant. They argue that if these countries are reaching out today, it may be because the alliance has demonstrated greater resilience than many expected. Critics once predicted isolation, economic collapse, or political fragmentation. Yet AES continues to function, coordinate policies, and maintain its presence on the regional stage. Of course, timing alone does not prove any hidden agenda. International relations are often shaped by changing realities. Governments adjust policies when circumstances evolve. Nevertheless, the simultaneous appearance of diplomatic initiatives from multiple directions has created a sense of curiosity across the Sahel, encouraging many people to look beyond individual visits and consider the broader regional picture. As people search for answers, another important question emerges: why has AES become so difficult to ignore? The answer begins with geography, resources, and influence. The Sahel occupies a strategic position connecting several regions of Africa. Trade routes, migration flows, security concerns, and economic interests often intersect across this vast area. What happens in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger rarely stays within their borders. The effects are felt across neighboring states as well. Beyond geography, the region possesses significant natural resources. Gold, uranium, and other valuable minerals have long attracted international attention. For decades, control over these resources has been closely linked to discussions about sovereignty, development, and foreign influence. As AES leaders increasingly emphasize national control over strategic assets, regional governments are paying close attention to the consequences. At the same time, AES has evolved into something larger than a security partnership. It is increasingly viewed as a political project with its own identity and vision, whether one agrees with every decision made by its leaders or not. The alliance has become a factor that regional governments must consider when planning their own strategies. This reality helps explain why diplomatic language may be changing. Governments generally prefer engagement with actors that possess influence, legitimacy among their populations, or strategic importance. The stronger AES appears, the greater the incentive for neighboring countries to maintain communication. For ordinary citizens across the Sahel, this creates an interesting dilemma. On one hand, renewed dialogue can reduce tensions and create opportunities for trade and cooperation. On the other hand, many people remain cautious because they remember previous disagreements and conflicting political positions. That is why the debate continues. Are these diplomatic initiatives signs of a new chapter in regional relations, or are they simply acknowledgments that AES has become a reality that can no longer be ignored? The growing attention directed toward AES cannot be separated from the image of one particular leader, Ibrahim Traoré. Whether admired or criticized, he has become one of the most recognizable political figures in contemporary Africa. His influence now extends far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. For many supporters, Traoré represents a generation of African leaders determined to place sovereignty at the center of national decision-making. His speeches frequently emphasize self-reliance, control over national resources, and the right of African nations to choose their own partnerships without external pressure. These themes resonate strongly with many citizens across the continent. particularly among younger Africans seeking new models of leadership. As a result, developments involving Burkina Faso often attract attention far beyond what would normally be expected for a country of its size. Discussions about AES are increasingly linked to broader conversations about African independence, economic control, and regional cooperation. In that sense, the alliance is no longer viewed solely as a security arrangement. It is also seen by many as a symbol of political transformation. This helps explain why every diplomatic approach toward AES is closely scrutinized. When foreign officials visit Burkina Faso or seek closer engagement with the alliance, many observers ask whether they are simply engaging with a regional organization or responding to a growing political movement that has captured public attention across Africa. At the same time, it is important to recognize that influence brings responsibility. The more visible a leader becomes, the more carefully every decision is examined. Supporters expect consistency. Critics search for weaknesses. Partners evaluate opportunities. Rivals monitor developments. For this reason, recent diplomatic outreach toward AES is being interpreted through multiple lenses. Some see opportunities for constructive cooperation. Others see attempts to shape the future direction of the alliance. What is undeniable is that the rise of Ibrahim Traoré has changed the way many people interpret political events throughout the Sahel. The growing influence of Ibrahim Traoré also explains why discussions about AES often extend beyond immediate security concerns. Across many parts of Africa, debates surrounding the alliance have become connected to larger questions about sovereignty, development, and the future direction of the continent. Supporters frequently argue that one of the most important lessons from African history is that nations must remain vigilant when navigating international relationships. They point out that diplomacy can bring investment, trade, and stability. But it can also create new forms of dependence if leaders fail to protect national interests. From this perspective, caution is not a sign of hostility. It is a sign of political maturity. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to assume that every diplomatic initiative is driven by hidden motives. Countries often change policies because realities change. Economic interests evolve. Security concerns shift. Regional priorities adapt to new circumstances. This is a normal feature of international relations. That is why many observers believe the most important question is not whether AES should engage with neighboring countries. The more important question is how that engagement should occur. Can cooperation be expanded while maintaining strategic independence? Can new partnerships be developed without compromising core principles? These are the issues that will shape the next chapter of the alliance. For Ibrahim Traoré and other AES leaders, the challenge is significant. They must balance openness with caution, opportunity with vigilance, and diplomacy with sovereignty. The choices made today could influence the political landscape of the Sahel for many years to come. As a result, the recent visits from Benin, Mauritania, and Côte d'Ivoire are being watched carefully by citizens throughout the region. Many people are less interested in official statements and more interested in the long-term consequences that may emerge from these renewed relationships. History offers an important lesson for every nation that seeks to protect its sovereignty. The greatest challenges do not always arrive through open confrontation. Sometimes they emerge through complex negotiations, economic incentives, political influence, or shifting regional dynamics. This is why many citizens across the Sahel believe that vigilance remains essential, regardless of who is extending a hand of friendship. However, vigilance should never be confused with isolation. No country can prosper by standing completely alone. Trade, diplomacy, security cooperation, and regional partnerships are all necessary components of long-term stability. The challenge is finding the right balance between engagement and independence. In the case of AES, several possible scenarios could explain the recent diplomatic activity. One possibility is that neighboring countries genuinely want to reduce tensions and improve cooperation after years of disagreement. Another possibility is that changing economic realities are encouraging governments to rebuild relationships that have become strategically important. A third possibility is that AAES has gained enough regional influence that other states now view engagement as a practical necessity. There is also a perspective shared by some observers who believe that diplomacy can sometimes serve as a tool for influence. While there is no clear evidence proving such intentions in the current situation, this possibility explains why many citizens continue to ask questions and examine developments carefully. Ultimately, the most effective strategy for AES may not be to reject diplomatic outreach or to embrace it unconditionally. Instead, success may depend on maintaining clear principles, protecting national interests, and ensuring that every partnership delivers tangible benefits to the people. The future of the Sahel will likely be shaped not only by military strength or political speeches, but also by the wisdom with which leaders manage opportunities, risks, and relationships in an increasingly complex regional environment. As we examine all these developments together, one conclusion becomes clear. The question is not simply whether Benin, Mauritania, and Côte d'Ivoire are reaching out to AES. The deeper question is why these diplomatic initiatives are emerging at this particular moment in history. Perhaps the answer lies in the growing importance of the alliance of Sahel states itself. What was once viewed by some observers as a temporary political arrangement has evolved into a regional actor that commands attention, whether through security cooperation, political coordination, or discussions about economic sovereignty. AES has established a presence that neighboring countries can no longer ignore. At the same time, caution remains a valuable principle. There is currently no evidence proving that every diplomatic approach conceals a negative agenda. Responsible analysis requires distinguishing facts from speculation. Yet, history also teaches that nations must remain alert whenever major strategic interests are involved. Cooperation and vigilance are not opposites. In many cases, they must exist side by side. This is where the broader vision of a Pan-African future becomes relevant. Across Burkina Faso and beyond, many citizens believe that the next chapter of Africa should be written by Africans themselves. Ideas associated with Pan-Africanism continue to inspire discussions about sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination. Leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traoré and other figures within AES have become symbols of that debate, whether one agrees with every policy or not. The challenge ahead will be determining how AES engages with new opportunities while preserving its core principles. The future of the African Union, the aspirations of an Africa new generation, and the hopes of millions who support greater sovereignty may all be influenced by decisions made in the coming years. One thing is certain: the story is far from over. Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and the broader Pan-African movement will remain at the center of conversations shaping the future of the Sahel. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. West Africa is shaking under the weight of terrorism, military coups, collapsing public trust, and growing anger toward the old foreign powers that once claimed they could stabilize the region. Across the Sahel, entire communities are living between fear and uncertainty, while governments struggle to stop armed groups from expanding deeper into African territory. Yet, in the middle of this dangerous crisis, something unexpected just happened. ECOWAS, the same regional bloc that once tried to isolate Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, has now sent a special envoy directly to Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the Alliance of Sahel states. This meeting was not an ordinary diplomatic visit. For many Africans, it was a sign that the balance of power in West Africa is changing faster than anyone expected. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer acting like isolated military governments under pressure. Instead, they are building a new security alliance, tightening borders, launching military operations, and openly challenging the old geopolitical order that dominated the region for decades. At the same time, many ECOWAS countries remain trapped in instability, political division, and worsening insecurity. That reality is forcing difficult questions across Africa. Is the AES becoming a new model for African sovereignty and self-defense? Has the old system already begun to lose control of West Africa? If you believe Africa is entering a new era of sovereignty and resistance, make sure you subscribe and stay with us until the very end. For years, ECOWAS positioned itself as the main authority in West Africa. After the military takeovers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the organization responded with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and threats of isolation. Many international observers expected the AES countries to collapse under economic and political pressure. But that never happened. Across the Sahel, terrorism is no longer an isolated crisis, hidden in remote desert regions. It has become a growing wave of instability threatening the entire future of West Africa. Armed groups linked to JNYM, ISGS, Boko Haram, and other extremist networks continue to move across borders with deadly flexibility. Entire villages have been attacked. Thousands of families have been displaced. In many rural communities, people no longer ask whether violence will arrive. They ask when. One of the biggest fears inside the AES today is that weak border control allowed terrorist networks to spread for years without serious resistance. Vast desert routes connecting Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Libya, and northern Nigeria became corridors for weapons trafficking, fuel smuggling, and militant movement. According to many security analysts in the region, open borders without strong security coordination created dangerous vulnerabilities that armed groups exploited repeatedly. This is why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have dramatically changed their approach. Instead of waiting for international missions or foreign coalitions to secure their territory, the AES governments are increasing military patrols, tightening border checks, expanding intelligence cooperation, and launching more aggressive counterterrorism operations. At the same time, the crisis is spreading beyond the Sahel itself. Countries like Benin and Togo are now facing increasing security threats near their northern borders. Coastal West Africa is beginning to realize that the instability consuming the Sahel could eventually move southward if the region remains divided and weak. For ordinary African families, these geopolitical debates are deeply personal. Parents want children who can safely attend school. Farmers want to work without fear of armed attacks. Traders want roads free from kidnappings and ambushes. In the eyes of many citizens, survival matters more than political slogans. For decades, many Africans were told that Western military partnerships and foreign intervention would eventually bring peace to the Sahel. Foreign bases expanded across the region. International counterterrorism missions operated for years. Billions of dollars were spent in the name of stabilization. Yet, despite all those promises, insecurity continued to spread across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This growing frustration created a deep crisis of confidence among ordinary citizens. Across many African communities, people started asking difficult questions. If foreign military operations were successful, why were terrorist groups becoming stronger? Why were villages still falling under attack? Why were young Africans still dying while foreign powers claimed to be protecting the region? That frustration opened the door for the rise of the AES. Unlike the older political structures tied closely to foreign influence, the alliance of Sahel states presented itself as something different. It promoted the idea that Africans must defend Africa with their own strength, their own military cooperation, and their own political decisions. For many citizens, that message carried enormous emotional power. The return of Pan-African sentiment has become impossible to ignore. Across social media platforms, radio discussions, and political debates, growing numbers of Africans are expressing support for leaders who openly challenge foreign pressure and demand greater sovereignty. To many supporters, the AES is no longer viewed simply as a military alliance. It is becoming a symbol of resistance, dignity, and self-determination. This does not mean every African fully supports the policies of the AES governments, but many people clearly believe that the old system failed to provide security, stability, or respect for African sovereignty. That belief alone is already reshaping political conversations across West Africa. Among the leaders emerging from the political transformation of the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has become the most recognized figure across West Africa. To his supporters, he represents a new generation of African leadership that refuses to accept foreign pressure, insecurity, and dependency as permanent realities. To his critics, he represents the growing influence of military rule in regional politics. But regardless of opinion, Ibrahim Traoré has already changed the political conversation inside Africa. Unlike many traditional politicians, Traoré built his image around military discipline, sovereignty, and direct involvement in the security crisis affecting ordinary citizens. He often appears in military uniform alongside soldiers rather than inside luxurious political settings. That image resonates strongly with many Africans who believe older political elites failed to protect the population from terrorism, corruption, and instability. For supporters of the AES, Traoré symbolizes resistance against dependency. His speeches regularly emphasize that Africa must defend its own territory, protect its own resources, and build military strength without relying entirely on foreign powers. Across social media platforms, his popularity has spread far beyond Burkina Faso. Many young Africans now see him as part of a broader Pan-African movement focused on dignity, sovereignty, and self-respect. At the same time, Western governments and international organizations remain concerned about the direction of the AES. Critics argue that military governments could weaken democratic institutions and normalize coups as political solutions. Some analysts also warn that military success alone cannot solve the economic and social problems damaging the Sahel. However, many citizens inside Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger respond with a different argument. They believe security must come first before political reforms can truly succeed. In their eyes, any government that cannot protect roads, villages, and families eventually loses legitimacy. That is why the recent meeting between ECOWAS and Ibrahim Traoré carried enormous symbolic importance. Not long ago, the AES leadership was treated as isolated. Today, ECOWAS itself is seeking dialogue, showing that the balance of power in West Africa may already be shifting. As the influence of the AES continues to grow, West Africa is also entering a new geopolitical competition involving outside powers searching for influence across the continent. Russia and Turkey have become two of the most important new partners for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Unlike the older Western model of intervention, these relationships are often presented as more flexible and based on mutual strategic interests rather than political conditions. Russia has expanded military cooperation with several Sahel governments through training, equipment support, and security partnerships. At the same time, Turkey has increased its presence through defense technology, military cooperation, and economic partnerships. For the AES leadership, these new alliances represent an opportunity to diversify partnerships and reduce dependence on traditional Western powers. However, this shift also raises serious questions. Some critics warn that replacing one foreign dependency with another cannot create true sovereignty. Others argue that African countries must avoid becoming battlegrounds for global power competition between East and West. At the same time, Western governments remain deeply concerned about the rise of the AES. Many fear that the growing popularity of military-led governments could weaken democratic institutions across Africa and inspire similar political movements elsewhere in the region. There are also concerns that continued instability may damage investment, economic growth, and humanitarian conditions. Still, many Africans respond with a different perspective. They argue that promises of democracy mean little when insecurity continues to destroy communities year after year. For them, the real struggle is not simply about elections or alliances. It is about restoring hope, security, and dignity to ordinary people. The future of West Africa may now depend on whether ECOWAS and the AES can find a way to cooperate despite their deep political differences. Terrorist groups do not respect borders, political systems, or regional organizations. As insecurity spreads across the Sahel and toward coastal nations, the pressure for coordination is becoming impossible to ignore. For many analysts, the recent dialogue between ECOWAS and the AES signals the beginning of a new political reality. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer viewed only as isolated military governments under sanctions. They are increasingly being seen as a regional bloc with growing influence, military coordination, and ideological impact across Africa. At the same time, the challenges facing the AES remain enormous. Military operations alone cannot solve poverty, unemployment, weak infrastructure, or the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of people across the Sahel. Long-term stability will require not only security victories, but also economic development, education, and trust between governments and citizens. Still, one lesson has become impossible to ignore. Many Africans now believe that the continent must strengthen its own ability to defend its people, secure its borders, and shape its own political future without permanent dependence on outside powers. West Africa is entering one of the most dangerous and transformative moments in its modern history. The region now stands between two possible futures. One path leads deeper into division, terrorism, foreign manipulation, and endless instability. The other path could lead toward a stronger and more self-reliant Africa capable of defending its own people and controlling its own destiny. The unexpected meeting between ECOWAS and the AES revealed something very important. The political map of West Africa is changing, whether the old powers accept it or not. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already become major actors shaping the future of the Sahel. Their alliance has forced difficult conversations about sovereignty, security, and the true meaning of African independence in the modern world. At the center of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, whose rise has inspired both admiration and controversy across the continent. To many supporters of Pan-African ideals, Ibrahim Traoré represents a new generation determined to protect African dignity against insecurity and foreign pressure. Others remain cautious, warning that military power alone cannot guarantee long-term prosperity or democratic stability. But one reality is clear. Millions of Africans are searching for new leadership models because too many old systems failed to deliver peace and security. The growing influence of the AES reflects not only military cooperation, but also a deeper emotional shift happening across Africa's new political consciousness. As the African Union, COWAS, and the Alliance of Sahel states navigate this uncertain future, the entire continent is watching closely. The struggle unfolding in Burkina Faso and across the Sahel is no longer only about territory or politics. It is about identity, sovereignty, and the future direction of Pan-Africanism itself. If you believe Africa deserves security, dignity, and sovereignty, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories shaping the future of the continent. What could push a former colony to shut the diplomatic door on the country that once ruled it for generations? That is the question now standing at the center of West Africa. Because Burkina Faso has taken a step that many people once thought was almost impossible. Just days after the European Parliament passed a resolution criticizing the political and civic situation inside Burkina Faso, the government led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced that it was cutting diplomatic relations with France completely, not reducing them, not suspending them, not recalling an ambassador for a short protest. Cutting them for Paris. This is not just another disagreement with an African government. It is a historic diplomatic blow, because Burkina Faso was once part of the French colonial system, and for decades after independence, France remained deeply connected to the country through politics, security, media, money, and influence. But Ouagadougou is now saying something very different. It is saying that sovereignty is not a decoration. It is not a word to be used in speeches and ignored in practice. It is the right of a nation to decide who enters its house, who speaks inside its house, and who must leave. If you follow the changing story of Africa, especially the Sahel, make sure you stay with this channel. Because what is happening in Burkina Faso may not stop at Burkina Faso. The question tonight is simple. Was the European resolution the final drop that made the cup overflow? The answer begins with what happened in Strasbourg. Members of the European Parliament approved a resolution criticizing Burkina Faso over restrictions on civic freedoms, political rights, and the overall security situation. To many observers in Europe, the resolution was presented as a call for accountability. But in Ouagadougou, it was received very differently. Officials argued that the document relied on inaccurate information, ignored the country's security challenges, and crossed the line between concern and interference. Within days, Burkina Faso summoned European representatives and rejected what it described as a paternalistic attitude toward a sovereign African nation. Government officials insisted that decisions affecting the country's future should be made by Burkinabe institutions, not by lawmakers thousands of miles away. In their view, the issue was no longer simply about criticism. It had become a question of national dignity, and then came the announcement that stunned international observers. On June 26th, Burkina Faso declared that it was severing diplomatic relations with France with immediate effect. The decision marked the complete shutdown of official diplomatic ties between the two governments. Ambassadors would no longer represent their states through the usual diplomatic channels, and the relationship entered its most serious level of tension without crossing into armed conflict. This was not merely symbolic. In international diplomacy, cutting relations sends one of the strongest political messages a government can deliver during peacetime. It signals that trust has collapsed to the point where normal dialogue is no longer considered possible. While the people of both countries remain free to maintain cultural and personal connections, the formal relationship between their governments effectively comes to a halt. For many Africans, the announcement represented a declaration that Burkina Faso intended to define its future on its own terms, regardless of the political cost or the reactions from traditional Western partners. By the time Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in September 2022, relations between Burkina Faso and France had already been under tremendous strain. Years of growing insecurity had fueled public frustration, and many citizens questioned whether decades of military cooperation with France had actually made their country safer. Instead of seeing stability, they saw expanding violence, repeated attacks, and entire communities forced to leave their homes. Traoré entered office promising a different course. His government declared that Burkina Faso would reclaim full control over its security policies and reduce dependence on former colonial powers. Those promises were quickly followed by action. French special forces were asked to leave the country. Military agreements that had existed for years were terminated. Several French diplomats were later declared unwelcome, while French state-funded media outlets, including France 24 and Radio France Internationale, were suspended after authorities accused them of spreading information that threatened national security. Each decision represented another step away from the relationship that had shaped Burkina Faso's foreign policy for decades. None of them, however, completely closed the door. Diplomatic ties remained intact, leaving at least one formal channel for dialogue between Ouagadougou and Paris. The decision announced on June 26 changed that completely. Supporters of Captain Ibrahim Traoré argue that this final step reflects a long-term strategy rather than an emotional reaction to one European resolution. In their view, the government has been systematically removing what it considers the remaining pillars of foreign influence, beginning with military cooperation, followed by media presence, privileges, and finally the official relationship itself. Whether one agrees with that strategy or not, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Each move built upon the previous one, creating a gradual but unmistakable transformation of Burkina Faso's foreign policy. The diplomatic rupture with France therefore appears less like an isolated event and more like the conclusion of a political roadmap that has been unfolding since 2022. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has become one of the most closely watched political figures in Africa, not simply because of his age or military background, but because of the message he has consistently delivered since taking office. At the center of that message is one idea: Burkina Faso must regain full control over its own future, even if that means confronting long-established international partners. To many of his supporters, Traoré represents a new generation of African leadership that places sovereignty above foreign approval. His speeches often emphasize that security decisions, economic policies, and diplomatic partnerships should be determined by the people of Burkina Faso rather than by outside governments. This position has earned him growing admiration among many Pan-African movements that believe African nations should rely more on regional cooperation and less on former colonial powers. Western governments, however, view the situation very differently. Critics have expressed concern over restrictions affecting political opposition, independent media, and civil society organizations. Human rights groups have also raised questions about freedom of expression and the conduct of security operations during the fight against armed extremist groups. From this perspective, Burkina Faso's recent decisions risk increasing diplomatic isolation while reducing opportunities for international cooperation. Supporters of Traoré offer a different argument. They contend that extraordinary security challenges require difficult decisions, and that every sovereign nation has the right to determine how it protects its citizens. They also argue that many Western governments criticize African leaders while overlooking their own strategic interests in the region. Whether one accepts this argument or not, It reflects a growing sentiment among many Africans who believe that relationships with foreign powers should be based on equality rather than dependency. This debate extends far beyond Burkina Faso. It raises larger questions about how African nations balance national sovereignty with international partnerships, security with democratic governance, and independence with economic cooperation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has become one of the most visible symbols of that debate, making every decision taken by his government closely watched both across Africa and around the world. Burkina Faso's decision may have been announced by one government, but its consequences extend far beyond one country. It also raises an important question about the future of the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as the AES, since its creation. The partnership between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has gradually evolved from a military security agreement into a broader political and diplomatic project aimed at strengthening regional sovereignty. The three governments have repeatedly demonstrated that they prefer to move together when responding to major regional challenges. They withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States after accusing the organization of serving external political interests. They expanded security cooperation among themselves and began exploring new economic and diplomatic partnerships outside the traditional Western sphere. Seen from this perspective, Burkina Faso's latest decision could become another chapter in a much larger regional transformation. That possibility has attracted significant international attention. Some analysts believe Mali and Niger may eventually adopt similar diplomatic measures toward France, if they conclude that doing so supports their long-term strategic goals. Others argue that each country faces different economic realities and security pressures, making identical decisions far from guaranteed. At this stage, no official announcement from either government suggests that such a move is imminent. Regardless of what happens next, one reality is already becoming clear. France's influence in the Sahel has changed dramatically over the past several years. Military withdrawals, declining political partnerships, and the emergence of new regional alliances have reshaped relationships that once appeared firmly established. Whether this transition ultimately produces greater stability remains uncertain, but it unquestionably marks the beginning of a new geopolitical chapter. For observers across Africa, the story is no longer simply about Burkina Faso or France. It is about whether African nations can redefine their partnerships while protecting both their sovereignty and their long-term development. The answer will likely shape not only the future of the Sahel, but also the broader direction of regional cooperation across the continent. The developments surrounding Burkina Faso also offer important lessons for the rest of Africa. Whether one agrees with every decision made by its government or not, the events of recent years have reopened a continent-wide conversation about sovereignty, partnerships, and national development. The first lesson is that political independence and strategic independence are not always the same. A country may have gained independence decades ago, yet still depend heavily on foreign governments for security, economic assistance, or major political decisions. Burkina Faso's leadership has argued that true sovereignty requires the ability to make difficult national decisions without external pressure. That idea continues to resonate with many Africans, who believe their countries should have greater control over their own futures. The second lesson is the importance of diversifying international partnerships. Relying too heavily on a single foreign power can create long-term vulnerabilities. Many African governments are now expanding cooperation with multiple partners across different regions, seeking to reduce dependence while increasing their diplomatic flexibility. This approach does not necessarily mean rejecting one partner in favor of another. Rather, it reflects an effort to create more balanced relationships based on mutual interests. Choice The third lesson concerns dialogue itself. While strong political statements can demonstrate determination, lasting stability usually requires open channels of communication. Diplomatic disagreements may be unavoidable, but history often shows that negotiations remain one of the most effective tools for reducing misunderstandings and preventing unnecessary escalation. Finally, Burkina Faso's experience reminds every African nation that symbolic decisions must ultimately produce practical results. Citizens will judge success not only by powerful speeches or historic announcements, but by improvements in security, economic opportunity, education, healthcare, and daily life. In the end, sovereignty achieves its greatest meaning when it creates measurable benefits for ordinary people. That will remain the true test not only for Burkina Faso, but for every nation seeking a more independent path in the years ahead. History often remembers moments when nations decide that the old way of doing things can no longer continue. Whether Burkina Faso's decision proves to be a turning point or simply another chapter in a long diplomatic dispute will only become clear with time. What is certain is that the relationship between Ouagadougou and Paris has entered completely new territory. The coming months will be closely watched across Africa and beyond. Will Mali and Niger eventually follow the same diplomatic path? Will France seek to rebuild trust through dialogue? Or will both sides continue moving further apart? Most importantly, will this new direction bring greater security, stronger economic development, and lasting stability for the people of Burkina Faso? Those are the questions that matter far more than political headlines alone. For many supporters of Pan-African ideas, this moment represents another step toward an Africa that makes its own strategic decisions without relying on former colonial powers. Others remain cautious, arguing that true independence must also be matched by economic growth, institutional strength, and opportunities that improve the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Time will determine which vision proves closer to reality. One thing is beyond dispute. Burkina Faso has placed itself at the center of one of Africa's most significant geopolitical debates. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the country has chosen a path that continues to generate discussion throughout the African Union and across the wider international community. Whether viewed through the lens of Pan-Africanism, diplomacy, or Africa New, the decisions made by Ibrahim Traoré have already become part of a much larger conversation about the continent's future. Now, I would like to hear your opinion. Do you believe Burkina Faso has opened the door to a new chapter for the entire Sahel? Or do you think this diplomatic rupture will remain an isolated case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy thoughtful discussions about Africa, Pan-African affairs, and the major stories shaping our world today, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next analysis. Just hours after the European Parliament adopted a resolution criticizing Burkina Faso, the government of Captain Ibrahim Traoré responded with a move that immediately captured attention across Africa and beyond. Instead of issuing a routine diplomatic statement, Burkina Faso summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a direct message. The country expressed its disappointment, its disapproval, and what officials described as profound disgust toward a resolution they believe was built on misinformation and outdated assumptions. At the center of the controversy lies a simple but powerful question. Who gave the European Parliament the authority to judge a sovereign nation that is not even a member of the European Union? According to the resolution, Burkina Faso faces worsening security conditions, shrinking civic freedoms, and growing humanitarian challenges. European lawmakers argued that large portions of the country's territory remain outside government control and warned that instability in the Sahel could threaten the wider West African region. For many observers in Brussels, this was presented as a concern for democracy, human rights, and regional security. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Officials argued that the resolution ignored the sacrifices made by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in their ongoing struggle against terrorism. They insisted that the document relied on inaccurate information and reflected a mindset that many Africans increasingly reject. What began as a parliamentary resolution quickly evolved into something much larger. It became a debate about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of nations to determine their own future. And as tensions rose, one thing became clear. This was no longer simply about security or human rights. It was about who gets to define reality for Africa in the 21st century. The response from Burkina Faso was not delayed, cautious, or diplomatic in the traditional sense. Within hours of the European Parliament's resolution, the government summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a message that left little room for ambiguity. Officials in Ouagadougou argued that the resolution was based on inaccurate information and failed to reflect the reality on the ground. More importantly, they viewed it as an unacceptable intrusion into the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. During the meeting, Burkina Faso's foreign minister made a point that would become the centerpiece of the country's response. Burkina Faso is not a member of the European Union. Therefore, the European Parliament has neither the authority nor the legitimacy to position itself as a judge over Burkina Faso's domestic policies, security decisions, or management of civic space. The government also challenged the credibility of some of the claims presented before European lawmakers. According to officials, the parliamentarian who introduced the criticism relied on figures and assessments that did not accurately represent the situation in the country. They questioned how such sweeping conclusions could be made about a nation that many of its critics had never personally visited. But the strongest language was reserved for what Burkina Faso described as a lingering neo-colonial attitude. Officials argued that the resolution reflected an outdated belief that African nations must constantly justify themselves before Western institutions. In their view, this approach ignores both national sovereignty and the sacrifices being made by countries fighting terrorism under extremely difficult conditions. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would not accept external actors defining its political reality or dictating its internal choices, whether one agrees with the government's position or not. The response marked a significant moment in the country's foreign policy. It signaled that under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso intends to confront criticism directly and defend its decisions on the international stage without seeking approval from foreign powers. One of the most controversial aspects of Burkina Faso's response was its decision to bring NATO and Libya back into the conversation. For officials in Ouagadougou, the current security crisis in the Sahel cannot be discussed honestly without examining the events that unfolded more than a decade ago. In 2011, a NATO-led military intervention contributed to the collapse of Libya's government under Muammar Gaddafi. While supporters of the intervention argued that it was necessary to protect civilians, critics have long maintained that the operation created consequences that spread far beyond Libya's borders. According to this view, the fall of the Libyan state triggered the movement of weapons, armed groups, and experienced fighters across vast areas of North and West Africa. The fragile security environment that followed created opportunities for extremist organizations to expand their influence throughout the Sahel region. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this historical context matters. Their leaders argue that today's insecurity did not emerge in isolation. Instead, it developed through a chain of events that involved decisions made by powerful international actors years earlier. This is why Burkina Faso reacted strongly when European lawmakers criticized the country's security situation without acknowledging what officials describe as the deeper roots of the crisis. From their perspective, it is unfair to discuss the consequences while ignoring the causes. Supporters of this argument believe that Western governments should recognize their share of responsibility for the instability that followed the collapse of Libya. Critics, however, counter that, regardless of past mistakes, current governments must still be judged by their ability to protect citizens and restore stability. The debate remains highly contested, but it has become a powerful political tool across the Sahel. By linking today's security challenges to earlier international interventions, Burkina Faso shifts the conversation away from immediate criticism and toward a broader discussion about accountability. As a result, the dispute with the European Parliament is no longer just about terrorism or governance. It has evolved into a debate over history itself, and over who bears responsibility for one of Africa's most persistent security crises. While the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may appear to be a diplomatic disagreement, many observers believe a larger transformation is taking place across the Sahel. At the center of that transformation stands the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as AES, bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What makes this alliance different is that it was not created merely as a security arrangement. It represents a political statement. The three governments have repeatedly declared that they intend to reduce external influence over their domestic and regional affairs while strengthening cooperation among themselves. For decades, regional security strategies in West Africa relied heavily on support from foreign partners, particularly France and other Western countries. However, after years of continuing instability and growing frustration among local populations, leaders in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began pursuing a different path. The creation of AES signaled that shift. The alliance seeks to coordinate military operations, improve border security, and develop common approaches to economic and political challenges. Supporters see it as an effort to create African solutions for African problems. The alliance has also taken symbolic steps that demonstrate its long-term ambitions. These include discussions on common institutions, increased economic coordination, and policies designed to strengthen regional integration outside traditional frameworks. Such moves suggest that AES is not intended to be a temporary response to a crisis, but rather a new geopolitical project. For European policymakers, this development creates new uncertainties. A region that was once strongly influenced by Western partners is increasingly making decisions independently. For the governments involved, however, that independence is precisely the objective. This broader context helps explain why criticism from the European Parliament triggered such a strong reaction in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso did not view the resolution as an isolated statement. Instead, many officials saw it as part of a larger struggle over who will shape the future of the Sahel. Whether AES ultimately succeeds or fails remains uncertain. What is certain is that it has already changed the political conversation across West Africa and beyond. Beneath the diplomatic language and political arguments lies another issue that many analysts believe is impossible to ignore: resources. The Sahel is not only a region facing security challenges, it is also home to some of Africa's most valuable strategic minerals, resources that have become increasingly important in a rapidly changing global economy. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's major gold producers. Neighboring Niger possesses significant uranium reserves that have long contributed to international energy markets. Mali is emerging as an important player in the lithium sector, a resource essential for batteries, electric vehicles, and future technologies. For supporters of Ibrahim Traoré and the broader alliance of Sahel states, these resources are at the heart of the current struggle. They argue that for decades, African nations exported immense wealth while receiving limited benefits in return. As a result, many citizens continue to ask a difficult question. How can countries rich in natural resources remain among the poorest in the world? Traoré has built much of his political message around that concern. He frequently emphasizes that national resources should first serve national development. According to this vision, gold, minerals, and other strategic assets must contribute directly to infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for local populations. This message has helped transform Ibrahim Traoré into more than a national leader. Across parts of Africa, he has become a symbol of a new generation of leadership focused on sovereignty, self-reliance, and economic independence. His speeches are widely shared on social media, and his image increasingly resonates far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Supporters view him as a leader willing to challenge long-standing power structures. Critics argue that symbolism alone is not enough, and that lasting success must be measured through tangible improvements in security and living standards. Regardless of where one stands, Traoré's growing influence helps explain why developments in Burkina Faso attract so much international attention. The debate is no longer only about one government or one country. It has become a discussion about who controls Africa's resources and who ultimately benefits from them. At its core, the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament reflects a much larger debate that extends far beyond West Africa. It is a debate between two competing visions of governance, legitimacy, and international responsibility. From the perspective of many European policymakers, raising concerns about human rights, democratic standards, and security conditions is both necessary and justified. They argue that governments should be held accountable when freedoms are restricted, humanitarian crises deepen, or instability threatens neighboring countries. In this view, international scrutiny is not interference, but part of a broader commitment to universal values. Burkina Faso sees the issue differently. Officials in Ouagadougou argue that no external institution has the right to dictate how a sovereign nation should manage its internal affairs. They maintain that security challenges, political transitions, and development priorities must be addressed according to national realities rather than foreign expectations. For them, sovereignty is not a symbolic concept. It is the foundation of independence. This difference in perspective explains why the reaction to the European resolution was so strong. The government was not merely responding to criticism, it was defending what it considers a fundamental principle, the right of a nation to choose its own path. The question, therefore, becomes larger than Burkina Faso itself. It touches on an issue increasingly debated across Africa, Asia, and other parts of the developing world. Should international institutions play a greater role in shaping domestic policies, or should nations retain the final authority over their own future, regardless of outside opinion? There is no simple answer. Yet the growing intensity of this debate suggests that the global balance between sovereignty and international influence is being redefined before our eyes. The confrontation between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may have started with a single resolution, but it has revealed a much deeper struggle over sovereignty, influence, and the future direction of Africa. For Burkina Faso, the issue is not simply about responding to criticism. It is about defending the principle that every nation has the right to determine its own political, security, and economic path. For the European Union, the debate remains tied to concerns about human rights, democratic governance, and regional stability. Between these two positions lies one of the defining geopolitical discussions of our time: the emergence of the Alliance of Sahel states, the growing emphasis on resource sovereignty, and the rise of leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traoré suggest that a new chapter is unfolding across the continent. Whether these changes ultimately succeed will depend not on rhetoric alone, but on the ability to deliver security, development, and opportunity to ordinary citizens. Perhaps the most important lesson for Africa is that sovereignty must be matched by responsibility, unity, and long-term vision. What do you think? Should international institutions have the authority to publicly judge the internal affairs of sovereign nations? Or should those decisions belong exclusively to the people of each country? If you enjoy discussions about Pan-Africanism, Burkina Faso, Africa New, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the African Union, and the future of Pan-Africanism, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next analysis. For years, many observers believed the alliance of Sahel states would struggle to survive. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger chose a different path, critics predicted isolation, economic hardship, and political instability. Yet in 2026, the conversation looks very different. Instead of asking whether AES can survive, many people are asking why neighboring countries suddenly seem interested in working with it. One recent development has attracted particular attention. Ivory Coast has expressed its willingness to resume security cooperation with Mali and Burkina Faso. On the surface, that may sound like a positive step toward regional stability. However, one question immediately emerged. Why was this message delivered in Paris rather than Bamako or Ouagadougou? That question has become the center of a growing debate across West Africa. Is this a genuine effort to rebuild trust between African neighbors? Or does it represent something much larger? In this video, we will explore the changing political landscape behind this unexpected proposal and what it may mean for the future of the Sahel. If you are interested in Africa's future and the major geopolitical changes unfolding across the continent, consider subscribing and joining this conversation. To understand why this proposal surprised so many people, we must look back at recent history. Relations between Ivory Coast and the countries that now form AES have been tense for several years. Political disagreements, security concerns, and diplomatic disputes created significant mistrust between the two sides. One of the most notable incidents was the detention of 49 Ivorian soldiers in Mali, a case that generated a major diplomatic crisis. At the same time, many supporters of AES viewed President Alassane Ouattara's government as closely aligned with policies that placed pressure on Mali and Burkina Faso. For that reason, the latest proposal appears unexpected. The real question is not why tensions existed. The real question is, what has changed enough to make cooperation possible again? The announcement from Ivory Coast was not controversial because of what was said. It became controversial because of where it was said. The proposal was presented during Eurosatory, one of the world's largest defense exhibitions, held in Paris. For some observers, that detail may seem insignificant. For many people across the Sahel, however, it carries powerful political symbolism. There are several ways to interpret this decision. The most optimistic interpretation is that Paris was simply the location of an international event where senior officials happened to be present. From this perspective, the statement represented a practical diplomatic opportunity rather than a calculated political message. A second interpretation suggests that the proposal was designed as a test. Before sending high-level delegations to Bamako or Ouagadougou, Ivory Coast may have wanted to gauge reactions from AES leaders and the broader public. In international politics, governments often release trial messages before committing themselves to formal negotiations. A third interpretation is far more controversial. Many supporters of AES argue that the choice of Paris cannot be separated from the historical role France has played in West Africa. For decades, major security and political decisions affecting the region were often discussed through channels connected to Paris. Because of that history, some people view the announcement as more than a diplomatic gesture. They see it as a symbolic reminder of older influence networks that AES has spent years trying to distance itself from. This is why the location matters. Imagine two neighbors attempting to repair a damaged relationship. One approach would be to sit down face to face and speak directly. Another would be to make the offer through a third party. Both methods may lead to the same result, but they create very different perceptions. Whether the message reflects genuine reconciliation or a cautious diplomatic experiment remains unclear. What is clear is that the decision to announce it in Paris ensured that the debate would extend far beyond the words themselves. What makes this moment particularly remarkable is that only a few years ago, many analysts predicted that the alliance of Sahel states would fail. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger chose to pursue a different political path, they faced diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and widespread skepticism from both regional and international observers. At that time, the dominant narrative suggested that the three countries would become increasingly isolated. Critics argued that they lacked the resources, partnerships, and institutional support needed to sustain their vision. Yet the reality that emerged has been very different. Rather than collapsing, AES has strengthened cooperation among its members. The alliance has developed joint security mechanisms, increased military coordination, and worked to build a common strategic direction. While significant challenges remain, the organization has demonstrated a level of resilience that many observers did not expect. This shift has changed how neighboring countries view the alliance. In politics, perception often follows reality. When a political project appears weak, few governments want to associate themselves with it. When that same project demonstrates endurance and influence, attitudes begin to change. The contrast between 2022 and 2026 is striking. Several years ago, discussions focused on whether AES could survive. Today, conversations increasingly focus on how other countries should engage with it. That transformation alone represents a significant geopolitical development. The growing interest from neighboring states may therefore reflect a broader recognition that AES has become an important actor in West Africa. Whether governments fully agree with its policies or not, they can no longer ignore its presence. This may be the deeper story behind Ivory Coast's proposal. The question is not simply why Ivory Coast wants to cooperate. The more important question may be why cooperation now appears necessary. As the regional balance of power evolves, countries throughout West Africa are adjusting to a new reality. AES is no longer viewed merely as a political experiment. It is increasingly being treated as a permanent part of the region's future. At the center of this discussion stands one of the most influential figures in contemporary African politics, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Although the proposal came from Ivory Coast, many people immediately began asking a different question. How would Ibrahim Traoré respond? The reason is simple. For many supporters across Africa, Traoré represents more than the leadership of Burkina Faso. He has become a symbol of sovereignty, self-determination, and the belief that African nations should have greater control over their political and economic futures. This perspective is important because it helps explain why the debate is not really about whether AES should talk to Ivory Coast. The debate is about the conditions under which such dialogue should take place. One common misunderstanding is the belief that independence requires isolation. In reality, these are two very different ideas. A country can defend its sovereignty while still maintaining diplomatic and economic relations with its neighbors. The key question is whether those relationships are based on equality and mutual respect. From that perspective, Cooperation with Ivory Coast would not automatically contradict the principles often associated with Ibrahim Traoré. What matters is the framework in which that cooperation occurs. If both sides engage as equal partners pursuing shared interests, dialogue becomes possible. If outside actors are perceived as shaping the process, skepticism naturally increases. This is where the choice of Paris becomes particularly significant. For many people in the Sahel, Paris is not merely a city. It represents a historical system of influence that AES has repeatedly challenged. As a result, some observers are less concerned about the content of the proposal than about the political symbolism surrounding it. Ultimately, the question facing AES may not be whether to engage with Ivory Coast. The more important question may be whether the proposal reflects a genuine African-to-African partnership. If it does, dialogue could strengthen regional stability. If doubts remain about who is truly driving the initiative, caution will likely continue to shape the response from leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré. Every major diplomatic opportunity comes with both benefits and risks, and the proposal from Ivory Coast is no exception. For AES leaders, the challenge is not simply deciding whether to cooperate. The challenge is determining whether the potential advantages outweigh the possible dangers. On the positive side, improved cooperation could strengthen border security. The frontiers connecting Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ivory Coast have long been vulnerable to the movement of armed groups, illegal trafficking networks, and other security threats. Better communication and coordination could help address some of these challenges more effectively. Economic considerations also matter. Ivory Coast possesses one of the most important commercial gateways in West Africa through the port of Abidjan. Stronger relations could improve trade routes, reduce transportation difficulties, and create new opportunities for economic growth across the region. However, supporters of AES often focus on a different issue: trust. Years of political disagreements and diplomatic confrontations have left deep scars. For many people in the Sahel, trust cannot be restored through a single statement delivered at an international conference. There are also concerns about influence. Because Ivory Coast maintains close relations with Western partners, some observers worry that cooperation could create channels through which external interests might regain leverage within the region. Whether these concerns are justified or not, they remain an important part of the public debate. For this reason, many analysts believe AES is unlikely to embrace the proposal without conditions. A gradual approach may be more realistic. Limited cooperation in areas such as border security, intelligence sharing, and regional stability could serve as a test of intentions before deeper partnerships are considered. The central issue is therefore not whether cooperation is possible. The central issue is whether confidence can be rebuilt slowly enough to protect sovereignty while creating practical benefits for all sides involved. The rise of AES has generated strong reactions both inside and outside Africa. Supporters see the alliance as evidence that African countries can pursue independent policies while protecting their national interests. Critics, however, often view the situation very differently. One of the most common criticisms is that AES risks isolating itself from the international community. According to this argument, distancing from traditional partners could reduce economic opportunities and weaken regional cooperation. Yet, supporters of AES respond that independence does not mean isolation. They argue that countries have the right to choose their partnerships based on national interests rather than historical expectations. Another criticism is that AES may be creating divisions within West Africa. Critics suggest that alternative regional structures could undermine existing institutions. In response, many supporters argue that lasting cooperation can only succeed when member states feel their sovereignty and interests are respected. From this perspective, reform and new approaches are not necessarily signs of division, but attempts to create a more balanced relationship among nations. These debates contain important lessons for the rest of Africa. The first lesson is that sovereignty remains a powerful issue across the continent. Many African societies continue to ask how their resources, security policies, and economic decisions should be managed. The second lesson is that self-reliance and international cooperation do not have to be opposites. Countries can engage with global partners while maintaining control over their own priorities. Perhaps the most important lesson is that influence is earned through resilience. AES gained greater attention not because others suddenly changed their opinions, but because the alliance continued to exist and adapt despite significant pressure. Whether one agrees with AES or not, its experience has become part of a larger conversation about Africa's future. That conversation is increasingly focused on how African nations can build partnerships that reflect their own interests, aspirations,